at the other end of the spectrum, you have some states that disenfranchise felons even after they have served their sentences and are no longer on probation or parole, although in those states there is a mechanism for restoring the right to vote on an individual basis. And as a practical matter, it's not terribly difficult to get the governor or his committee to review your case and to have your right to vote restored, although it depends on how recently your crime was committed, what the crime was, whether it was part of a series of crimes and things like that. Okay, well, so that's, oh, I should one final point. I think that as a federalism matter, this all makes perfect sense. There's no reason why, if people in Maine and Vermont want to let felons vote, even when they're still in prison, if they want to be progressive states and figure out ways to do that, and they think that this is a good idea, fine, let them. But if other states, in their experience, have determined that this is not a good practice, then they should be allowed to disenfranchise felons. And one problem with the federal government passing a one-size-fits-all law in this area is that it becomes very difficult to make the kind of careful case-by-case inquiry that I think practically makes sense. That is, as I say, you would want to know what crime the person was convicted of, whether it was part of a series of crimes, how recently the crime was committed. Those are things that are going to would be very difficult for Congress to pass one statute that addresses these issues for all states. States have all kinds of different ways of criminalizing different behavior. What's illegal or what's a felony in one state may not be a felony in another state, and so forth. So for Congress to pass one law, I think, would be very difficult. So in addition to not having the authority, I think that as a practical matter, it doesn't work very well either. Okay, well, so that's my pitch for why Congress does not have the authority in this area to pass a one-size-fits-all law. Now I'm going to shift gears and talk about why there actually are, I think, good reasons not to allow felons the right to vote. The soundbite that I use when I talk about this issue, with the press, is to say that, well, if you're not willing to follow the law, then you can't claim a right to make the law for everybody else. And of course, that's what you're doing when you vote. You're either making the law directly, if you're voting on a referendum or something like that, or you're making it indirectly by choosing lawmakers. And I think that there's a lot of sense to saying that, well, gee, why should we be allowing people who are not willing to follow the laws themselves tell the rest of us what we should do? That just, intuitively doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But a more elaborate answer, I think, is to look at the issue this way. There's a sort of instinct in the United States today to think that, well, gee, everybody should vote. We let everybody vote. But when you think about it, that's actually not true, right? There are people besides felons whom we don't allow to vote, like, for instance, children. We don't let children vote. We don't let non-citizens vote. I mean, if you happen to be here in the United States, either working or a tourist or something like that, but you're not an American citizen, you're not allowed to vote. That seems to make sense. In most places, if you've been adjudged mentally incompetent, you're not allowed to vote either. And again, if you think about it, if you're, you know, trying to, you know, you're looking out over your state and you're trying to decide, well, you know, who should we be allowed to vote? This all sort of makes, you know, some intuitive sense. Well, you know, of course we shouldn't be letting, you know, children vote. We shouldn't be letting, you know, non-citizens, you know, foreigners, you know, people who are not, you know, Americans, they shouldn't be allowed to vote. We shouldn't let people who are in the insane asylum, you know, vote. And if you have people who are committing mayhem against their fellow citizens, you know, who are depriving their fellow citizens of their life, liberty, and property, you know, illegally, it seems very counterintuitive for them to be given a say in running the government. That just doesn't seem to make, you know, a lot of sense. Again, I think when you think about it, you know, what we have are certain objective minimum qualifications of responsibility and trustworthiness and commitment to our laws that we require of people before we allow them to participate in the solemn enterprise of self-government. I mean, that seems to make a lot of sense. And these standards are not terribly high, but they do exist. And some people don't meet them. And, you know, you can't expect a 4-year-old, you know, to meet those standards. And you can't expect somebody who is not an American to have the best interests of the country, you know, at stake, even if he does happen to be here, you know, on election day. You know, obviously people who are, you know, mentally incompetent aren't going to have those, you know, be able to meet those standards. And the same thing is true of people who are committing serious crimes against their fellow citizens. You know, another way to think about it is, why do we basically let everybody vote? You know, why is that sort of the default position now, you know, in the United States? And I think that, I mean, you all can think about it yourselves, but as I think about it, it seems to me that there are, you know, 2 basic reasons. One is that we get better decision making that way. You know, there's the point that individuals are foolish, but, you know, in the aggregate, they're wise. You know, it's sort of like investing in stocks. You know, you want to have a wide portfolio. If you don't let everybody vote, then you get into the business of figuring out, well, you know, who are we going to allow to vote to make sure that we make the best decisions? And, you know, it was a conservative, you know, William Buckley, who made the famous statement that he would rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than by the faculty at Harvard. And I think he was right. It's very hard to sort of come up with requirements for figuring out who wise voters are going to be. And so, therefore, we let everybody vote. And that's a good way to ensure wiser decision making. Okay? I think that's, you know, a very plausible rationale. Another reason might be that it's wrong to boss people around without giving them some say in the government. You know, this is the old taxation, you know, without representation is wrong argument. If we're going to be taxing people, we should give them some representation in Congress. If we're going to be bossing them around in other ways, we should do that too. Okay? That's another reason why, and since the government bosses everybody around, one way or another, they should be able to, I mean, everybody should be able to have some say in the government, right? So, I mean, those are both arguments for having a very broad franchise. However, if you look at it that way, there are good reasons for concluding that criminals, in particular, should not be allowed to vote. This sort of presupposes that the people who are voting, in the first case, that is, where we're trying to ensure good decision making, that the people who are voting, have the country's best interests at heart. If you have people who don't have the country's best interests at heart voting, then there's no particular reason to think that allowing them to vote is going to lead to wiser decision making. That's one reason why, for instance, we don't allow non-citizens to vote. I mean, to take it to an extreme example, a German, living who happened to be in the United States during World War II would not vote in a way that reflected the best interests of the United States. We don't allow non-citizens to vote. And the same thing is true for people who are hostile to following the law. Likewise, people who are not willing to follow the law can't really use the taxation without representation argument. They aren't following the law anyway, so how can they complain about the fact that the government is bossing them around without having some say from them? They weren't doing, the government bossing them around wasn't having the intended effect, so they can't really say now that they have the right to continue to vote. So I think that those arguments are fairly compelling for why it makes sense to disenfranchise people, at least for some period of time, once they've been convicted of a serious crime. As I'll discuss in a second, I don't think that should be a lifetime ban, for every felony. But I do think that having a sort of presumption once you've been convicted of a felony, which by definition is a serious crime, that you lose the right to vote makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, so those are my arguments. Now, in my remaining time, let me talk a little bit about how I would answer the competing arguments that are frequently made on the other side. As I indicated earlier, one fact that is driving a lot of the debate and the interest in this area is the fact that you have these racial disproportionalities. The fact that a disproportionate number of felons are African American or to a lesser extent Latino, and that therefore these laws are racist or racially discriminatory. I say that's not true. I don't think that defining a law as racist simply because it has a disproportionate racial effect is a fair definition of racism. I mean, you might as well say that these laws are sexist because the disproportions in prison populations between men and women is even more than that. But the fact that you have these disproportions doesn't make these laws sexist any more than it makes them racist. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you, if we were to enfranchise felons, the people whose votes would be diluted, thank you, people whose votes would be diluted the most would be law-abiding people who live in high crime areas. Areas where lots of felons and formerly convicted felons live. Those people happen to be disproportionately poor people of color. So saying that these laws are anti-black is, I think, not true. For variety of reasons. Another argument that's frequently made is that, well, you know, why should we be disenfranchising people who have paid their debt to society? Okay, this is the phrase that, you know, is used. They paid their debt to society, and so why should they be disenfranchised? But there are a number of problems with that argument too. The first one is that the people making it, I think, don't really believe it. And the reason I say that is because if they really thought that there was a correlation between paying your debt to society and being allowed to vote, then they would not want people who hadn't paid their debt to society to be able to vote. But a lot of the people on the other side who are pushing for felon reenfranchisement will admit that ultimately their aim is to have prison inmates being allowed to vote too. So they obviously don't believe that there is this correlation between paying your debt to society and voting. They think that people who haven't paid their debt to society should be able to vote too. Another problem is that the argument really proves too much when you think about it. I mean, yes, people who have served their prison time have paid their debt to society in the sense that they are now allowed to come and go on their own, you know, recognizance. But that doesn't mean that the rest of us, or that the government has to forget the fact that they've committed a serious crime. I mean, there are all kinds of other consequences besides not voting that continue to follow even after you have completed your service, your sentence in prison. For example, felons generally are not allowed to possess firearms, okay, even though they have paid their debt to society. Felons are generally not allowed to serve on juries. Felons are ineligible for a lot of jobs, and I think most people would be perfectly understanding of the fact that, for instance, you know, somebody convicted of a sex crime is not allowed to teach or work near a public school. That seems to be just common sense, even though they have paid their debt to society. I mean, really, you know, this whole paid your debt to society, I don't know who came up, you know, with that phrase. I had to do a little bit of research to find out what the origin of it was. But, you know, it really doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about it. I mean, paying your debt in the usual situation means that, for instance, you know, you want to buy a house, okay? But you don't have the cash to buy a house. So you go to the bank, and the bank says, well, that's cool, you know, that you want to buy a house. We're happy to loan you the money. But then you'll have this debt, and you'll need to pay it off. And, you know, you want to have a house, we're okay with that. We like to make money, that's what we're about. So, you know, you're going to have to pay your debt back, and you're also going to have to pay, you know, a little bit extra too, because that's, you know, why there's something in it for us, okay? And so ultimately the debt is paid off, and you have your house and you're happy, and the bank has the principal